What we're going to do now is really dive into this presentation. So as we've been looking at a lot of the trade issues that are going on yesterday, if you were in the state of the industry, you were hearing all the complexities of what's going on. You also had the opportunity to hear Ambassador Michaela talking about what USTR is doing and what some of the priorities are that they're seeing. What we'd like to do today is really talk a little bit more about what the Almond Board team has been doing to address some of the concerns that you all have to really make sure that we can keep almonds flowing into our export markets. Now, as part of that report card, as we go through things, we thought we'd first let you hear from another ambassador, and this is Ambassador Eric Garcetti, who is ambassador to India, our largest export market. So with that, hopefully. Okay, do we have sound? Sorry. We could probably lip sync for him at this point. Let's see if we can get this going. No? Okay. Well, we'll hopefully play it later. It was actually just some very nice comments on what's been happening in India and the opportunities based on the retaliatory tariffs that have now been lifted. I would say that working in India always is interesting. We'll talk about that a little later, but Ambassador Garcetti is a real champion for everything we are doing in the market. Sorry, we'll just let them set this back up. Okay. All right. Can you click through or do I need to? Okay. Just like trade, you just have to be flexible, right? You know, you just never know what's going to happen.
Roll with the punches.
I knew I shouldn't have put Ambassador Garcetti in there. That was it.
It's Ambassador Garcetti's fault.
Well, if that's not going to work, we can just go on to the presentation. Ah, there he is. Is that going to run now? Or not? Okay. All right. So if we start looking at our report card, you really have to start with tariffs. And as you know, with market growth, we're dealing with a lot of different issues. And I would say tariffs are certainly the most obvious concern. When we look at opportunities, we've actually had some successes in this area. We've managed to apply for some tariff suspensions, both in Philippines and the UK. We're hoping to hear back on the results of those efforts early in the new year. But of course, we're still dealing with retaliatory tariffs in China and Turkey, as well as additional duties that Turkey has put on. If we start moving to some of the technical issues, really what's clear here, and as you were hearing from Jonathan during the State of the Industry presentation, we've really had some successes, but it does sometimes feel like one step forward, two steps back. What we've seen here is things have worked on some of the issues we've been dealing with, but there's a lot of lingering concerns. So as we mentioned with India dealing with NOCs, with labeling, we're still trying to get conclusion on some of these areas. In the EU, we seem to have ongoing concerns, but we are starting to make some progress, even on pesticides, where EU legislation has started changing to reflect the fact that some of these standards are just too restrictive even for them. As we start looking at regulatory comments, this is the other big area where the board's been involved. You really have to have fact-based information to deal with so many of the issues we have out there. And this is where I would say the Almond Board's been particularly effective, utilizing the data we have in the industry, conveying that through comments, either directly or through some of our alliances. And I think we've submitted quite a few over state, federal, and international levels over the last few years. Finally, relationships. This is the other big driver on the trade space. And I would say here too, we've been very effective in building relationships, as you'll start hearing during our discussions today. And this is about amplifying our message, working through coalitions. So it's not just the almond board or the almond industry here in California that's expressing a concern, but it's really being put forward by customers, importers in those markets where we're working. And this is, I think, again, an area that's been of particular importance, making sure that we're viewed as a trusted resource and a valued partner. So what we're going to do with this panel is really dig into some of these issues a bit more. And we've got the opportunity to really look at it from throughout the supply chain. The speakers we have today are Keith Schneller, who's with the Almond Board staff and formerly working with USDA and also USTR, who brings a wealth of experience to the services I hope that we're providing to you. Jonathan Hoff, who you know from Monte Vista Farming, who's also chairman of our Global Technical Regulatory Affairs Committee. And then finally, very pleased that Tim Harrison from Intersnack was able to join us. As you know, Intersnack is one of the largest, if not the largest, buyer of peanuts, very active in obviously tree nuts throughout Europe, with a number of brands that you'd recognize if you're traveling almost anywhere in Europe. So what we're going to do is have a little bit of a discussion with our panel. And then what we'll do is we'll open it up for questions from you. So let me move over here. Right. All right. So, okay. I don't need this now. So as we start, maybe just going right down the row, what do you see with everything that's been going on? What are some of the real priority areas that you see that we're going to have to deal with over this year? So,
Well, you want to start with me?
why don't we start with you?
Okay, well, starting from my perspective, essentially, I'm a buyer and I'm buying for a number of European processing facilities that we own. For me, one of the things that I think that we need to be focusing on is really being able to push the almonds. It's that consumer price that we were talking about yesterday. A lot of people were talking about that, getting that consumer price a bit lowered out to the consumers, because what you have to understand is, from a European's perspective, the European consumer has been dealt with a number of things since COVID. You know, there was COVID, there was the supply chain, the sea freight, the inflation. And one thing that I don't know gets as much attention here is the war in Ukraine, which has meant that we've had to move our entire energy policy around. So it's remarkable that Europe has been able to survive as well as it has without going into a long, deep recession. But what we have to do is that last kink in getting all of this mess worked out is really be able to present the consumer with a price that is going to get the product moving. And to that end, we need to be working very actively with the retailers on the types of communications we can be doing, the types of promotions and things like that to help do that. But ultimately, I think that's where the retailers, if they lower the price, it will increase the consumption.
Jonathan.
Yeah, I would say that along those lines, the number one priority for me from an industry perspective, related to trade, would be tariff reduction, removing retaliatory tariffs, specifically in China and Turkey. I think that those tariffs are not only limiting access to those markets that growers so desperately need right now, but they're extracting a tremendous amount of value from the chain, right? That could be pushed back upstream towards packers and ultimately towards growers. So I'd say retaliatory tariff removal and more free trade agreements or beneficial trade agreements are probably my number one priority from an industry standpoint, and in my opinion, would do the most quickly to improve pricing and increase the amount of shipments that we have going into some pretty important markets for us, right? We've had the retaliatory tariffs reduced in India, which was great, but relative to Australia, we're still effectively double what their rates are. In China at 50 or 55%, whatever it is at this point. We're way higher than Australia's 0%, right? And these alternate origins are going to be something that we deal with going forward. Australia is still producing a lot of almonds. Spain and Portugal increasing the amount of supply that they have there. So those are headwinds that we'll have to fight against, and removal of these tariffs would really help. Secondly, from a packer standpoint, I would say all of the smaller technical issues, the non-tariff barriers, things like labeling, or what we talked about yesterday during the State of the Industry, the fact that rules that already exist in markets are being unevenly applied or enforced by various member states of the EU, to use the EU as an example, which creates a tremendous number of issues. And oftentimes there are issues that don't arise until you've got a container stuck at a dock somewhere. And that causes not only tremendous delays in cash flow, but ultimately provides customers with, forgive me for saying this, not all customers, but reasons to sort of wiggle out of contracts when it's to their favor, and ultimately, again, extracts more value from the value chain. So from an industry standpoint, tariff reduction, from a packer's perspective, really getting these technical issues ironed out.
Well, yeah, I was with USDA and the Foreign Agricultural Service for over 20 years, and almost half of that time I spent living and working in China, Greater China. And then I was at USTR under the Trump administration when the trade war kind of hit. And I think a lot of trade negotiators have been frustrated over the years with the lack of progress that was made with some of the negotiations. And previous administration came up with some very unique ways of dealing with some of those issues, and that was by using the Section 301 and 232 tariffs. And then while I was there, we started working on the U.S.-China Phase 1 agreement, and it was amazing how willing China was to come to the table and make some changes. And I think the majority of the changes or commitments that they made in that agreement have gone through, and we've seen an enormous amount of agricultural trade to the China market. But I think there's still a lot of concern about relying too much on China, and there's been a lot of incentives or encouragement from now this administration to continue our diversification away from the China market. So it's still a major important market. It's our third largest export market. We still have those retaliatory tariffs in place. There's a waiver system for some of the tariffs, but the steel and aluminum tariffs that are in place there are there, and they really haven't been discussed. Ambassador McKillop, who was here yesterday, said that they are making plans to start discussing some of those issues with some new Chinese counterparts here in the next couple of months. So we're hoping that we'll see some changes on Decree 248. Some of you are familiar with. That's one of the Chinese facility registration requirements that went into effect back in 2022. And I worked with a lot of handlers to make sure that we were able to get their registrations in place so they can continue exporting to the China market. But we still have a handful of companies that are waiting to be registered. And we also discussed that with Ambassador McKillop, and we're hoping to see some progress. So we're still working on some of those technical issues. On the tariffs, like Julie mentioned, we discovered that the Cranberry Commission had some success in the EU with the tariff suspension process. So we're looking at possible tariff suspension in the EU on almonds, which we're hoping that something might happen. The Philippines, we were working with the Almond Alliance to make a request for removal of tariffs on almonds going into the Philippines, and also a similar request with the UK. So there are some things that we can do even without U.S. government support that doesn't require an FTA. There are things that we can work together with our partners in these countries to address some of those issues.
I think building on that, Tim, we've talked about in the EU, we have a TRQ, we have obviously the 2% in quota rate, we have a higher duty. We've talked about, is there an opportunity to pursue the tariff suspension in Europe? I know it's challenging because, of course, you have production in Europe that might not see things the same way we do as exporters. But do you see that as something worth at least pursuing and exploring? What do you think about that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I know that when you look across the Atlantic, it's easy to see a sort of fortress Europe, that it's just one big wall there, but it really isn't. There are ways of getting around, as we've discussed before. When you go in through perhaps one of the smaller nations, go in through their parliament, such as the Netherlands, who imports a huge amount of nuts and processes a lot of the roasted, salted, and things like that. When you can have those kind of countries as your conduit for going in, and you can start to make some headways. The Dutch, for example, are extremely focused on trade. So you'll find a welcome reception in that particular region. And it's a lot easier than going to a much bigger country like Germany and trying to make your headway there. But it still has an equal voice in Europe. I think another thing to point out, though, we've mentioned briefly, Spain and Portugal have their own growing regions as well. But they're also importing quite a lot from California as well. So it isn't just a zero-sum game when you're looking at Spain. They have an interest in being able to do business as well. And one of the things that I think California has as an advantage there is a much more centralized sort of approach coming from California, whereas when you look at the almond industry in Spain, it's kind of every man for himself. So you have the ability to speak more with a single voice here, which gets heard much better than what they're doing in Spain.
Right. Maybe before we move away from tariffs too, one of the things that this administration has talked about is the onesies, twosies. So getting small changes maybe in other areas. Keith, one of the things that you could discuss a little bit is we've looked at now hulls and trying to get market access for hulls. There's also been a lot of discussion about focusing beyond just almond kernels and in-shell. Do we maybe start to look at some of the manufactured product, roasted product? And duties. I mean, do you see that as another opportunity?
Yeah, on the almond hulls, we've been feeding almond hulls to dairy cows in California for 75, 80 years. And it looks like there might be some great opportunities overseas for us to start shipping some of these almond hulls. And we've been working on an agreement with the Chinese. We have an import protocol already in place. But before we could start shipping, we had to make sure that almond hulls were listed in the official Chinese catalog, their feed ingredient catalog. And we just found out last week that request has been approved. So we're still waiting for a few more details, but we've got 5 or 6 companies lined up that can start shipping hopefully in the next few months. So that will be a new market. And then, looking at some of the tariff rates that are out there, it's interesting sometimes, like even in China, the tariff on the Chapter 20 on the roasted products is actually lower than the tariff on the raw products, Chapter 8. So there's some strange things out there with the way some of the tariff profiles have been set up. So it's something we can take a look at. And I know Blue Diamond has done a great job with their brand building and focusing on some of those value added products. But it is something that we could look at more in the future rather than the focus on shipping raw in shell or kernels overseas.
Mhm. And I think the other part of that evaluation, and it's something that we really haven't done probably as thoroughly as we need to from a board perspective, but looking at those additional taxes and fees that we never really hear about. And I think it was really with Turkey that we saw how they were using a lot of these facility fees that are applied at import. And I think that's another one that we really need to take a closer look at.
Right. I would say to the handlers and exporters here who are in the audience, if you run up against some of those, well, it'll really be your importers who run up against some of these issues with reference prices or all of these additional fees that are tacked on the import price coming in. So, there's some national treatment issues under the WTO. If that country is charging certain fees on those imported products, but they're not charging similar fees on their domestically produced products, we can go after them on that. And those fees actually really increase the total tax or cost of bringing those products in. So we know with Turkey, their bound rate is 43%. And right now their tariff on almonds going in is 15%. And then there's a 10% retaliatory tariff. But when you look at those extra costs that are tacked on because of the reference price and those other fees, it's a much, much higher revenue or customs revenue that's being paid if you didn't have those other fees.
Mhm. Turning to maybe another issue as we start looking at some of the challenges that are out there, we have quality issues this year. We have higher insect damage. We have pinhole. We've already seen what that means in terms of aflatoxin levels. Tim Birmingham was talking about what we're seeing in the crop. So that's certainly going to be a challenge in terms of how we address that in our export market. So, Jonathan, what are you seeing in terms of how you're dealing with that?
I could describe it accurately, but I'd have to say some pretty foul language up here. But it's not pretty this year. The 2023 crop obviously has been tremendously high in serious damage for a number of different reasons. I think winter sanitation was challenging this year. Obviously, growers pulling inputs and pulling sprays didn't help anything. But now we're dealing with the aftermath of all of those things and trying to ship this product into high quality, sensitive markets that obviously provide this food to consumers who are expected to be safe. Going forward, I think this will not be the anomaly it is right now. We'll probably have more years like this. What's particularly troubling from a regulatory perspective is that so many of the tools that we would normally use to control these types of things are being removed because of MRL restrictions and those types of things. And so even post-harvest materials that we would use to control pests inside of our warehouses and so forth are now kind of on the chopping block. And so it's my biggest concern right now is that because of regulation that is sort of running uncontrolled in some of the markets that we depend upon, growers here in the States and packers also will be limited in terms of the tools that we have at our disposal to control things like navel orangeworm, PTB, of other various pests, both in the field and in the processing facility. And so I think that's a challenge that we need to remain focused on. And I think part of it's going to be the industry itself educating key stakeholders and regulators, really through the work that you guys are doing and stay in communication with them at all times about what we're really doing here in California. Some of you heard in the State of the Industry yesterday us talk about what growers in California are already doing in terms of operating in California, but also being really good people who are stewards of the land. Like, we do good work, right? There's this perception out there that we're sort of blowing chemicals everywhere and using harmful stuff. But really the risk is pretty low. We don't like to use more than we have to. And so telling that story, I think, is going to be important. I think it makes things like the CASP program important, to collect data, share with regulators, et cetera. But yeah, I think with respect to the quality issues that we're dealing with right now, we got to be proactive in making sure that we retain as many of the tools that we have today to control those things in the future.
And Tim, you're having to deal with it on the other side with the product that's getting delivered to you. So how are you managing this situation?
Well, I would say that one thing that we did was earlier in the harvest, so at late September, early October, our vendor assurance manager for Almonds, as well as the director of all vendor assurance for Intersnack, they came to the valley and they drove up and down and met with people and saw what was going on. So because I had been here a few weeks earlier and was starting to report these kinds of things, and we wanted to kind of give a forward report to the organization to let them know this is what's coming and that we will have to make a concession on pinholes because it's not something that there is equipment that can sort it out. And that we're looking at a much larger size almond overall. And so, we have to be prepared to readjust our own formulations because when you're putting things in a mix, and suddenly your 2730 becomes 23, then it affects the other products that are in that mix as well. So we're having to adjust all of that forward. But that's why we do like to come out here to California and really meet the people, get to talking to everybody. We do a full vendor assurance audit of our handlers and making sure that everything is in line. But we are aware that there have to be concessions during certain times. And this appears to be one of those times.
Okay. Is that an area perhaps that, we could leverage companies like yourselves and others as we deal with the authorities? Because obviously on an import level, uh, they're just looking at the numbers, they're looking at the analysis, and, if it's there, it's there. So do you see that as an
Yes, I
option?
think absolutely. We are the ones gathering the data of what we're receiving in because we have to put it through a quality control at an external lab.
Mhm.
So we have all of this independently verifiable data of what we're seeing. And that is a rich source of information that can be taken along with us to go talk to the Dutch authorities as maybe the starting point of getting that in there and saying, look, this is what's happening, and here are the reasons why it's happening. We're going to see it in the 23 crop with pinholes. We'll probably see it in the 24 crop. Some say we'll see it worse in the 24 crop. So it is something where it's not just a one-off. It's not just a shipping delay. It's not just one of those types of things. This is something that needs to be addressed. And a company like Intersnack, I kind of want to point out, much like all of you, I work for a family-owned company. We are not a publicly traded company. We're not just worried about next quarter's reports. We are in this for the long haul. We've been in it for the long haul. We will carry on being in it for the long haul. And so we want to be able to partner up with the ABC and with the other boards as well. We've worked with other, with the pistachio and the walnut people as well
We
to
won't
be
hold
able
it
to.
against you.
No, but to make a market approach, but we can also be using this. We have a lot of these kind of contacts on the marketing side, so with the retailers, but also with the authorities as well. So we have a lot of insights and we can be helpful in moving those kind of issues forward.
I think that's really essential, and it's important for our industry to understand that as well as importers, that especially in Europe, you have member states that take certain actions, which we can also talk about. But then it ladders up to the commission. And so if the European Commission decides they're seeing a lot of rejections, they can take a stand, but they take input from member states. So being able to work through industry in Europe to bring that information forward, I think really gives us an opportunity to try and head off some of that European decision making if you have a member state advocating for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But that, still comes back to this whole idea too of getting credit for what we do. And I think this was something, we discussed during the state of the industry. It's no secret that climate, environmental issues are a big focus globally. Everyone's concerned about the quality and state of the world. But in that concern, I think a lot of consumers and regulators don't understand what's already being done and how much you can and can't control at a grower level.
Mhm.
So, this industry has really leaned into addressing these areas. We've talked about all of the incentives today, things that we're trying to do to help growers. How do we get that information out there, and how do we get credit for what we're doing, not only with regulators, but with customers? So, Jonathan, how are you working this through with your customer base?
That's a good question. I should probably know the answer to that, but I would say, honestly, it's all about telling the story. I think, the world of sustainability, climate, smart ag, and so forth is still sort of malleable and a bit undefined. And so, as I mentioned earlier before, it's about just telling the story of what we're already doing. So, the again, in California, we have so many tools in terms of funding for things like irrigation technology, the Healthy Soils Initiative, whole orchard recycling, those types of things. And I think to this point, a lot of growers take advantage of that, but we don't do a good enough job of always packaging that information up and telling that story to our customers, right? And I think relative to other origins and competing tree nuts, we do a heck of a lot simply because of where we operate. And so it's going to take continued industry engagement. It's going to take continued work from handlers to sort of package this data and continue pushing it out to our customers and really showing how we excel at all of these types of things. But unfortunately, it's also going to take some concession on this idea that we're going to get a premium for it. Back when sustainability started to be a thing, it was our hope and our expectation that we would be able to go out, package this, and achieve a premium in the marketplace that would offset the additional investment that we had to make in the field. Unfortunately, right now, the reality is customers expect it and are not willing to pay for it. And so at some point, it's going to become table stakes, right? You have to deliver it in order to be in the game. And the premium is going to come in the form of having access to markets and opportunity, right? So you want to be the first, want to be in the top 5 phone calls that companies like Intersnack make when they're looking to buy. And to be in that top 5, you're going to have A, B, C, and sustainability, right? So I think it's about accepting it, doing it, leveraging CASP, and telling that story.
Tim, what about you? I mean, we've got so much going on here in California.
You do. Absolutely. You have a lot. And again, that's the advantage of being a single state. For us, it's the kind of one-stop shopping when it comes to working with a sustainability. I'll say stewardship because I know that's a much nicer word. Stewardship. You have done a lot. We need to be able to kind of codify it so that it fits into the way of communicating forward that we have to do. I want to point out that it's not something that I as a buyer only require of my processors and growers. This is something that we as Intersnack have to do ourselves. So we're walking the walk. We do a lot more potatoes than we do almonds, I can tell you. And there's an entire agricultural department who's working on the sustainability of that. Our factories have to be off natural gas, and we're moving to electricity only, which is 4 times the price of the natural gas because it doesn't heat your oil and stuff as efficiently as natural gas does. So, and we have a number of these other types of initiatives on solar panels and wind turbines and things like that. I'm based in Sweden, so solar's not such a big deal during the winter. But yeah, we're doing a lot of these wind turbine things as well. All of these initiatives that we're trying to buy cleaner ourselves. But it is a benefit for California that we are able to come to you and say, okay, here's our sustainability team. They have this set of questions, and we go to one source for all of the set of answers that come out of it. And to me, that's a real advantage over another category like pecans, which is spread across the whole South, and you have it in Mexico as well. There we have to go almost, on an individual basis and say, what is it that you're doing for stewardship? What is it that you've been doing? And they come to us and they say, help us to codify this because we do all these things, but we don't know how to put it in a nice package and so that it ticks all the boxes. So that's, I think, where we have the advantage. And that's why our sustainability department has been coming to you first because you're further along than the walnuts, the pistachios and pecans. You're farther along with it. So you do have the great story to tell. And I think when it comes to that sustainability as well, this issue that we hear a lot in Europe is that, hashtag almonds take up too much water. The way that you've come up with that infograph is amazing way. I've shared that with our branded marketing people to say, here's how we combat that with something that is just as focused. It's bite-sized, but it has some real content to it, and people can grab onto it and hang on to it. Yes, our sustainability team, they tend to be kind of wonks, and they want the big graph, they want the total encyclopedia of data, and they'll love swimming around in that. But we have to really be able to get that message out for the consumers to fight that perception that almonds take up too much water. It's a ridiculous perception, especially when they're sitting there, drinking their coffee and, eating tomatoes and everything else that take up a whole lot more water.
Exactly.
So, but there are these types of tools that you've developed that I think will go a long way in helping to fight that perception.
Mhm.
If I could just make a follow-up comment to some of your points, Tim. If you could do us the favor of also informing people that sustainability also means economic sustainability, that would be great. When I hear you talk about, going from natural gas to electric at 4 times the cost, things like that just rattle our brains over here, because in the world of almonds, there's literally no meat on the bone right now. And so making those types of investments solely for the sake of making those type of investments or operating under the umbrella of ESG, just it at any time, but especially this time, doesn't make a lot of sense to us. And so I think that's one thing that the buying community is going to have to do a good job of doing on our behalf with consumers. Like, look, sustainability does mean taking care of the planet, but it also means surviving, right?
Absolutely. And I would want to put a bit of nuance in there, because what I'm buying for is both branded and private label. And those are really two different worlds. On the branded side, Intersnack owns that. We control that. We have much more flexibility in the way of our approach to that. But when you're getting into the private label world, I have one of my colleagues who very well, who says those private label retailers will talk about sustainability for 364 days a year. And when we're sitting there, and we're the ones who have to sit there with the price with them as well, and they will simply not go for that. It is a tough issue. I want to point out, it's tough for us also as Intersnack to work in a market where the prices are declining, because that same pressure is being put on us as well. We're trying to cover our fixed costs in our production as well. And so we're feeling that same, problem that you're having here. We're feeling it over there as well. And that's why we want to get the retailers to lower that consumer price, get the volume moving, get some more liquidity in this, and make it a more even market. I know for a fact that one day I, as a buyer, will be the one who's on the back foot. I know it'll happen. If you look back at the history, you can see when it did happen. So I believe that if we have a well-balanced market, that it benefits both sides. But I don't like this wild swing back and forth. I'll be the next one who gets on the back foot.
I mean, along those lines, and a little bit of what you were saying too about telling the story. I mean, we have a lot of tools that are industry level, but when it comes to things like eco scores and some of these other issues that are being driven at a country level, it gets confusing as far as, does the information need to be all the way down to the tree, or are we talking about industry information? And I think that's the other thing that gets challenging in these conversations, because even as we look at Asia as well, we're trying to figure out, just to what level of granularity are we talking about?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell you that Intersnack is working to have one level of sustainability, that it's not going to be that for France, we want this type of sustainability, and for Germany, we need another one. We're working as one company across an entire group with one sustainability team that's providing this information to all of these groups. So I would say that in that regard, what we're asking for, what we're really trying to do is take what you have right now and figure out the best way to kind of codify it for our own targets that we have as well, because we have this science-based target initiative, something like that. Alphabet soup that we have with all of these things. Yeah. So we have that same thing, and we have to kind of take what you have and put it into the proper boxes. But it does seem that we're quite well on the way with doing that because you have so much information already, you have so much data. It's more of a question of having our sustainability take that, our teams take that and plug that all in so that by the time we get to 2025, the path is smooth.
Mhm. Keith, from your time in some of these markets and in the issues that we're talking about with some of these, requirements on pesticides, technical issues, do you see that some of the authorities are receptive to having conversations on these things? Because it feels like they're still setting their own specs at this point.
Well, I think there's been a lot of push over the years to come up with international standards and MRLs that we can all work off of. Some countries still haven't really done that. China is still kind of out there. China's still been pretty flexible on MRL related issues. One of our concerns has been with the EU and their mirror clause proposals and the Green Deal and farm to fork proposals, but a lot of that has kind of gone away here in the past couple of years with inflation and, of course, the situation in Ukraine and vegetable oil prices and grain and all of that. So it seems, I think these policymakers, they do use some of these tools to restrict imports to a certain point, depending on the situation. But at the same time, for food security and all of that, I think there is a goal overall to come up with international standards and harmonize things. And again, you all in California, I live in Fargo, North Dakota, so I'm in a different state, and we have different commodities there. But it really seems like in California there are already so many controls in place. The data, your pesticide residue information, all of that is already being collected. So the state of California is way ahead of the rest of the United States when it comes to having access to this type of information. So I think we'll be in pretty good shape with the EU going forward. And the whole mirror clause thing is a little bit concerning, because if the EU passes certain legislation for their growers and restricts the chemical tools that they can use, and then they also force their trading partners to adopt the same types of rules, that's going to make it more problematic for us when we're exporting to their trading partners as well. But here in the past couple of years, I think they've really kind of backed off that whole mirror clause approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that is probably the glimmer of sunshine I think that we're seeing in all of this, is that we are seeing Europe back off a little bit on the MRL side of things and realizing that taking these really strict approaches may not work. But equally, a lot of the conversation with our trade negotiators has been around ensuring that the standards that are being set are consistent with what we do here in the US. And so our standards become equivalent or the basis for some of the rules going forward. And I think that's part of the opportunity for us staying engaged in these areas.
Yeah.
So now we've got about 13 minutes left. And what I'm going to do is ask each of our members here to kind of just give a final statement or two on biggest challenge. And then what we want to do is open it up, because part of our report card is really about how we're servicing you, how we are responding to the issues that you've identified. And on a trade and technical level, that's really what fills our day, is making sure that we're responding to the needs out there. So I'll give you each a chance to give a last comment, and then we'll open it up and take your questions. Any market, any issue, we'll try and answer. So.
Okay. Well, I would say that from my point, I want to offer Intersnack as a conduit to working with the retailers and working with the European consumers. We've worked with other categories and the boards of other categories on very direct types of promotional activities. And I think we could be doing that very effectively on the almond side as well. So I would look forward to to doing that. Our people meet with the buyers from these retailers on a weekly basis. So we have a very good in with them to be able to maximize those types of things. So they're, again, partnering up and bringing California into Europe through Intersnack, which is a good way of doing it because we're very much aligned with our retailers. We're very much aligned with our consumers in the various markets, and we can help you to communicate into certain markets. You might not use the same communication in France that you would use in Sweden, for example. So we have all of that information at our fingertips, and would like to be the conduit for that.
I know where to find you, Tim, so be careful what you offer.
In terms of priorities, like I said earlier, I think dealing first with retaliatory tariffs, then all of these additional costs, taxes, and so forth in some of these critical markets, I think is the number one way to at least bring back some dollars into the value chain that we can push back into grower pockets, and ultimately that's going to be the sustainability of the industry. After that, I think dealing with all of these technical issues out there that are causing hiccups. One thing that I'll add, unrelated to priorities, is just how awesome your team is, Julie, and Keith, and the rest of the GTRA team. It's tremendous. And for those of you who don't have a lot of exposure to board activities and specifically what GTRA does, I'll just tell you that these guys are working around the clock, 24 hours a day, on an airplane to some far-flung place on the planet to work on your behalf. And the issues that they're dealing with, the things that we've discussed today, are like the tip of an iceberg. You only see the top 10%, the rest of it's still below the surface. And if you had the opportunity to sit through one of my very boring track committee meetings, you'd hear a whole list of things that these folks have on their plate, and that they're staving off on our behalf. And so just want to add that plug in here that the board, the entire staff, but especially GTRA team, Julie, Keith, and the rest of the crew do a tremendous service to this industry. And, I've gone on 5 delegation trips to DC now, and the level of respect that is held for the Almond Board and staff, both on Capitol Hill, but also within USDA and FDA and USTR, is tremendous. Every time we go through there, we hear that, boy, I wish all of the other commodity boards and marketing orders had their stuff together the way the Almond Board does and the entire industry does. So that's my last comment there that I'll add for you guys. Thank you so much for what you do.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Well, thank you. It's for me, it's been an honor and a privilege to work with the Almond Board. And when I was with USDA and USTR all those years, I worked with many, many different commodity groups, and really the Almond Board always stood out as a leader. And I had no idea how deep the Almond Board goes into the agronomic side of things, all the way to marketing and labeling and the whole work. So, and the other thing I learned in China that's so important for trade is guanxi, your relationships. And Julie Adams and Tim and Jonathan, we have these strong relationships and with our handlers and exporters, our importers. So that's the key to success, I think, is having those relationships. And if we can't solve problems through our U.S. government support, we can work those problems on the other side with our importers and those trade associations on the other side. Well, we're in discussions with TÜKSAI, the Turkish Nut Association, on this tariff issue right now. So we're always able to find problems, but sometimes we're not aware of the problems. So this next part of this session is we want to hear from you what issues are there that are out there, and we're happy to join in to help find ways to solve problems.
No, exactly. The earlier we get involved, especially on some of these issues, the better, because if we can head it off before it rises to a political level, that makes it somewhat easier. So I can kind of see folks out there. There are mics. Feel free. I'd really like to hear from you all what some of the issues are. I know this is not a shy crowd. So let me stand up so I can see. Right.
Hey guys, thanks for, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my name is Jasbir Sidhu. I represent an organization called PUG. We have 300,000 plus acres and a lot of farmers. So I know there's a lot of hard work that is being done by the board. If we look at the marketing order, the main key point there is market stability and growing the demand. And neither one of those has been out there for the last couple of years. It's going down, it's in the wrong direction. And I hear you with all the trade issues, with all the additional fees and everything and so forth, that is a challenging. But let's ask a question even in the US. The farmers are getting anywhere on average of $1.50, and the retail here is about $7. Where's the break? Is it the break is farmers are getting overpaid, or the Almond Board and the team is not able to really have a good communication or marketing programs that are able to convince the consumer, like we did before when the almond growth was there, that it was working before, somewhere along the way is totally broken. The farmers are paying with their 4 cents, $60 to $80 million a year. Is that enough? Or there needs to be more? You're running out of funds, and as a result of it, the whole industry is going down. So these are a lot of different questions at this point. A lot of the family farms you will not see, as you look at this year, they will no longer be around. And the result is, who's really responsible? We look up to the Almond Board for guidance, for your leadership role. So my questions from all the farmers I'm bringing to you is, what are you doing? Where did you fail? Where are the disconnects?
Great questions. I think those are questions that the entire industry needs to be asking. You're right. I think the board was originally designed and intended to grow demand ahead of supply, right? And that's why, in terms of the budget, and I don't want to speak for the marketing side of the organization because we're on the technical side. In terms of the budget, that is where the vast majority of the dollars go. Our budget represents a tiny part of the overall spend from the board. In terms of where we failed, that's a tough question. I would say that if we had to go back and really take an introspective look, and I'm looking at Richard here, we may have tried to stave off some concentration exposure, right? Focusing on one market over any others. I would say that in terms of the stuff we're talking about today and what Julie and her team focuses on, I mean, like I said before, I think in terms of extracting dollars back from the value chain, pushing those back towards growers, we got a lot of opportunity here in terms of reducing tariffs, reducing taxes, and reducing all of those things that just basically put money in the pockets of the countries that are importing almonds as opposed to having go back into grower pockets. You mentioned earlier the retailers, specifically here in the States. I don't know, honestly, what the Almond Board could be doing, to Tim's point, to help retailers see the need to reduce prices, but it's crazy. I mean, walnuts, almonds, whatever, like you said, you're getting $1.50 per pound, but there's still $7 on the shelf. I don't know that the board is really designed to have that conversation with retailers, but that's probably a point where handlers like us need to really focus and say, look, guys, like, we got to change this. We got to fix this. Tim mentioned it earlier. Bring down your prices. Let's move some volume, get some product out of the system. But outside of that, I don't know. We don't really sell directly to many retailers. We sell to companies like Tim's that do manufacturing and private label and all that kind of stuff, and then they deal with retailers. So I can't personally speak to that, but maybe Tim, you'd have the ability to do that.
Well, I can't speak about the American market, but I do know that in Europe, the approach that I would take is to show to the retailers. I mean, it's it's all capitalism. You can't make them lower their prices. But what you have to do is show them that they can make better margins by doing bigger volumes. And this is what we see is that the consumers aren't buying as much because they have tighter budgets themselves. So if a retailer is keeping their prices up, and I would suggest that maybe there are those retailers in Europe who are doing that, then the best way to convince them to do things is by taking a sort of a targeted approach on building either a brand awareness or the value of the almond itself, the health benefits, so forth, and really but with a point to the retailer saying, you have to move more volume and you'll make more money. Right now, a problem with private label, as I said before, branded and private label are two different worlds over there. Private label doesn't have anything to chase. They are just sitting fat and happy. And if they have a thick margin on something like almonds, why should they lower it? Because they're still going to sell almonds. What we have to be able to show them is that by moving more volume and by creating more dynamism in those categories, they can make more money.
Thank you for your response. This comes question back to demand and stability. Demand is in terms of revenue, not unit volume. So I'm requesting from all the farmer growers that we talk about revenue growth versus unit growth. When we're saying unit growth, it literally means kill the farmer. When we're saying a revenue growth, if you look at it last 10 years, that curve is a totally different curve. And I totally agree. What we're really saying is be more transparent. It didn't seem like a lot of the marketing program, not to pick on them, is doing anything brand awareness building. And the second thing is almond taking, as you mentioned, too much water. Is all the things we have done hasn't changed. What are some of the reasons why we failed?
Well, going back to your point about looking at revenue growth as opposed to volume growth, I think that's a great point, and that's one that we remind anyone we can get in front of in DC in particular, particularly when they cite stats about record exports, record shipments, and all that kind of stuff. Well, who cares if you're shipping 3 billion pounds at 50 cents a pound? Like, that you're not doing any good. So you're right, and I would say that from my perspective, I recognize the same thing. Going back to a point you made earlier about marketing and the spend. By the way, the chairman of the Global Market Development Committee is sitting right over there too, if you want to ask him about that. So you're welcome, Brian. You asked if it's a big enough spend, like do we need more dollars, all that kind of stuff. And I would say the answer to that question, and again, I'm not the expert in this world because that's not part of our committee, but marketing's incredibly expensive, and the board has to be extremely strategic about where they focus and how they sort of divide those dollars in key markets. And when you're trying to cover a market like China or India, I mean, huge populations, geographically speaking, massive. Even with a $50 or $60 million budget, allocating a portion of that to both of those markets, it's not a lot relative to what companies like Pepsi, Coke, Lay's potato chips, whatever, would be spending in those markets. So it is a relatively small budget. In terms of where we failed, I don't know. I'd say there's a lot of headwinds out there right now. We've lost a bit of our health halo. Global consumers are changing, interest rates, all that kind of stuff. We're seeing it. People still want almonds. They're having a tough time selling them. I think it's part because consumers are changing a bit. When you still get the same paycheck, you got to go buy milk, butter, eggs, bread. Not a whole lot of meat on the bone there for almonds and luxury types of snacks. But then also retailers. I mean, you bring up a really good point. When retail prices are still sky high, but raw material prices are super low, somebody's absorbing that margin. And I can't sit here and tell you I know who that person is or how to change it. Sorry.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I just wanted to bring all the issues the farmers had. So at least It's here. It's in the forefront of it. Everyone talks about it. The question on marketing really was, there's never enough money. Totally agree. But is it worth killing the industry from the farmer perspective not to spend and get somewhere to stability? There's definitely breaks. If we can't control the retailers, we can't control the middle. The only guy who's going to get hurt, who will be totally out, is a farmer. And that's happening everywhere.
I know it's terrible. I'm a third generation grower, so I'm old enough to remember the stories my dad told about the early '80s, a time that was sort of just like this. And it's unfortunate right now that there are going to be multi-generational family farming operations that don't survive 2024, and it's terrible. And I'd say everybody who sits on the board, I'm not a member of the board, I'm a committee chairman. Everybody who sits on the board, everybody who's on staff is fully aligned around resolving that in any way we can.
I know this is an important topic. We're certainly happy to continue this conversation after the session, but I know we're getting to the end, and I do want to give, if anyone did have a question or something related to some of these issues, to give you a chance before we have to end.
I mean, first off, Uncle G, great questions. Awesome topic, you're right, about family farm getting killed. I just want to ask something a little bit different. So I'm an intern for smaller processor, Buffalo Almond Company, and the question I have is, so a little bit of an analysis mixed with a question. So of course we have all-time low almond prices right now, right? We can hopefully infer that they will go back up, right? And when they do go back up, price sensitive countries with a low medium income like China and India, they're going to see their demand go down, right? Because prices are going to be higher. And with that tariff, that just kind of puts another obstacle in place, right? When prices go high, right? And you know, when prices go high and we see demand in India and China go down, that's just going to help bring prices back down. So what can we do as a almond community in helping reduce those tariffs? Because China and India, those tariffs are very high, and we have to do all we can in helping reduce that. Is it up to us as the whole almond industry to do what we can, or is it just up to the politicians?
I would say that, first of all, that's a great question. And I would say that the Indian market has just been an absolute rock star, like stable growth, almost regardless of what price is doing. And they have been a huge benefit to the California almond industry. And fortunately, they have what's called a specific duty, not an ad valorem duty, meaning that it is a set fixed rate of rupees per kilogram. So it doesn't matter what the invoice price is. So almonds could be $5 or $2. It's still going to be 35 rupees per kilogram of in-shell imported. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to the GST, but that's a little bit different. To your question of what does the industry need to do, just be vocal. I mean, anybody who will listen, who has any ability to influence trade discussions, be vocal. They need to hear about it, and we need to be a pain in their ass.
There's only so much that local congressmen can do, right? We can go and speak to, you know, Jim Costa, David Valadeo. Only so much they can do. Prices go back up, it's just going to be tough in those markets. High tariffs. Yeah, I'm just trying to, you know, get your guys' opinion on how we can help reduce those tariffs, because it's going to be vital.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I can't really speak about the tariffs that the U.S. has with China or India on this topic, but I would say that Intersnack watches India very closely, and there is a ratio with cashew and almonds that is very important to keep monitoring, because when you say if the prices go up, it's going to, you know, those tariffs are going to hurt, and it's going to, but there is that ratio with the cashews that you really also have to watch as well.
Last thing, one other thing that I'm just afraid of is you know, President Trump, right? Although I do agree with some of the stuff he does, if he comes back into office, we're just going to see more trade escalation with China and India. I just feel like it's going to hurt the almond industry even more. So that's.
I can't speak to that. I would say, in my opinion, if he did come back into office, I would hope that he'd finish what he started. You know, I'd say when this whole thing began, I was optimistic that it was going to be short-term pain for long-term gain, right? That's what we sort of kept telling ourselves. And then COVID hit, administration changed, and there's just it's just nothing happening now, especially on trade. It's frustrating. I get it. I mean, even when we're in Washington, DC, talking to folks on Capitol Hill, folks in USTR, again, anybody who will listen, you know, it's always great to hear from you. Love the almond industry, but you know, and sometimes there's strings attached to it too. Like this administration will fight for you if you attach climate smart agriculture to something, right? And so, man, I all I can tell you is that everybody on this stage, everybody in the Almond Board office, and everyone on the board are focused on resolving all of this stuff. We're making movements, right? Getting things done. I think the removal of the retaliatory tariff in India is a perfect example. We were in DC and we sat with Ambassador Garcetti, had breakfast with him the day that announcement was made, and he delivered that news. But it's not enough, right? And that was our message. It's not enough.
Just for show for the
Exactly, the state visit. So I agree, right? My point to him was thanks, but Australia is still half of what we are. You know, let's do some real deals and kill this stuff. Otherwise, it's gonna, you know, we're losing ground. We're losing global share. I mean, all the points that you guys have both just made are totally valid. They're real, and I think that's why I say my number one priority is reducing these tariffs. Because if we do that, I mean, that's not 2, that's not 3, that's not 6 cents back in your pocket. Like in some cases, like 80 cents. You know what I mean? Like it's the difference between getting $1.50 and $2.30. It's meaningful, it's material, and it's worth fighting for. So I wish I could sit here and tell you that I know exactly how to do it outside of rely, because I can't go twist, you know, the Indian government's arm. I can't go twist China's arm directly myself. You know, Julie, you know, you can take a crack at it. But technically speaking, we are the Almond Board of California. We are a federal marketing order, and we don't have the ability to advocate on the industry's behalf. So we collect data, we inform, and we educate. So I think additional things that you guys could be doing as growers is partnering with the Almond Alliance or Western Ag Processors or anybody who can advocate on behalf of the industry. They're the ones that can actually go into Capitol Hill and ask for things to happen, right? And so what the Almond Board does in that regard is package all this information in addition to providing it directly to people who have the ability to influence change, also providing it to the Almond Alliance, right? So that Aubrey can go fight on the industry's behalf and truly advocate. So any information that you guys have that you could share with Julie or with Aubrey or with anybody who has the ability to create change related to some of the stuff that you just brought up, your uncle just brought up, we're going to die. Mm-hmm. That's real. Real families are going to be out of farming, lose a lot of money. Send that to Aubrey. You know, she can use that as an example, but hopefully go and influence people to make change. So outside of that, we're trying every day.
Well, and I want to come back to where we started on this, and that's that it's going to take a holistic approach to deal with everything we're dealing with. Never underestimate the value of being a squeaky wheel on all of these issues with anybody who will or will not listen. They really need to understand the importance of trade, the importance of these technical issues to the well-being, the economic sustainability of this industry, all the way back to the orchard. And so if there's anything that comes out of this session, it's hopefully an understanding that it's complex. It has a lot going on. Unfortunately, it is not short term, but as long as you're really sticking with a consistent message and you're building those relationships to get that information out there, you can start to have an impact. The retaliatory tariffs in India, would we like it to be more? Most definitely. Would we give it up? Hell no. You know, I mean, getting that movement is really important. And so I think that's what we have to continue to do. We are well beyond time, but I really appreciate your attention, your involvement. Just reminding everybody that you do have dedicated trade show time. We have the lunch that will be starting. I think it is starting. and breakout sessions. And with that, I would like to just, as people leave, just play Ambassador Garcetti's video. Thank you all for being here.
Good afternoon. I'm Ambassador Eric Garcetti. Now, I'm a Californian, but I now proudly serve as the U.S. Ambassador to India here in New Delhi. And it is such a pleasure to congratulate the California almond industry on the occasion of your 2023 annual conference. This meeting comes at a challenging time for all agriculture, for almond growers in California and in our export markets. But from my time serving as mayor of Los Angeles, I well understand the economic issues impacting you at the state level. With 70% of your almonds destined for export, you're also being impacted by the conditions in a number of other markets. But here in India, I'm working hard because I know you have a tremendous opportunity. The board's activities continue to be extremely effective in growing demand for California almonds by leveraging the unique cultural traditions here and expanding your consumer audience, as well as encouraging the development of new products using almonds. I serve almonds in my office, and I'm pleased that we worked hard this year to announce the tariff reduction during Prime Minister Modi's state visit to Washington, D.C. in June, when I'd also had the opportunity to meet board staff and industry members. But there is clearly a need to continue our broad-based approach, focusing not only on consumer marketing, but also our ongoing engagement with Indian authorities. The technical issues are complex, not easy to overcome, but we here at the U.S. Embassy are committed to supporting the almond industry, working closely with your Almond Board team to continue growing the great demand for California almonds here in India. I look forward to welcoming you to Delhi, and I wish you a successful season.